This is David Bernstein, founder of the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and this is the Jewish Contrarians podcast with my partner in thought crime, Brandy. Hello, Brandy.
Hey, David.
All right, so this has been a long dormant podcast, but I have to tell you, both Brandy and I get people who say, "Whatever happened to that?" And so we had a good time doing it, and we got busy with other things. But you know what? There's some really important topics, some of which we might even disagree with every once in a while. So we want to bring that to you for your consideration. And I don't know where we're going to disagree this time, but we are now back in full swing in the school year. The Jewish Institute for Liberal Values is very much engaged in K through 12 education. That's our primary area of activity. There are myriads of problems in K through 12 education. There was a very important article by Abigail Schreier in the Free Press recently about what's going on, very in-depth. Brandy was featured in there. There was another article about a figure in the Philadelphia school area, also in the Free Press, that was quite controversial in nature, and I think also inspired by one of our key staff people, Mika Hackner. So this is where we're at, and I thought it would be instructive for us to spend a little time talking about where this is all coming from. And a lot of times we talk about the role of ideology, and obviously that's true, like this oppressor-oppressed ideology that it is found it's in schools and other institutions. But I actually think, though, that there's another level that's really important to understand here about where this radicalism is coming into our schools. And when you look at, particularly after the sort of George Floyd moment, a lot of schools said, okay, you know what, we haven't gone nearly far enough on these issues of diversity, equity, inclusion. They conducted all kinds of equity audits and anti-racism audits and the like, and they went through these processes. And many of them, in some fundamental ways, started to shift the emphasis in schools from what I will call sort of a collective performance metric to a student achievement gap metric. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. So beforehand, many schools would sort of figured out how they were doing by how their students scored on standardized tests. And if their students were doing better in reading and writing, that meant that their schools were getting better and the like. Now, you can argue with whether or not that was an adequate measure of schools. I haven't necessarily been a huge fan of standardized testing, but I understand if the schools are not performing, you need some way of figuring out at a fundamental level whether they are. But what schools did is they said, well, that's not the issue. The issue is equity. The issue is the disparity gap among racial groups. So they started to look at that instead. And what that did is it put them on a fundamentally different course of action. And you had a whole school system switch to this metric. And so the goal was no longer, can we raise the scores of every student, but rather, can we narrow the gap between racial groups? And so then they started installing entire bureaucratic structures meant to sort of switch the emphasis of schools into this equity paradigm. And I think that's where we've gone wrong. That now there's a group of people basically in charge in schools that is pushing this paradigm. But those people also have very deeply politicized commitments, and they tend to also have strong views on, the oppressor ideology more generally. And it empowers and provides a permission structure for all manner of craziness in education. And while that's all happening to boot, it is affecting a huge decline in literacy and numeracy rates. So that is sort of my diagnosis. Brandy, am I wrong?
Not quite, but a little bit. No, I have a different opinion, only slightly. Of course, when I was a kid, I couldn't stand standardized tests, not because I did poorly, but I just got anxious and nervous about it ahead of time, not really knowing how to prepare. But I think we've actually looked, or the field of education has been looking at standardized tests from the wrong angle. Instead of just an assessment on what a student knows, what a kid's able to learn, what they've learned, what they've grasped conceptually, I look at standardized tests as maybe we should use them to assess, is the teaching method working? because the assumptions made with the standardized tests is they're wrong, they're bad, they're biased. And that's why there's an achievement gap, an academic achievement gap between these racial groups. But the standardized test actually wasn't really used to its fullest ability to measure was the teaching method the best to use to teach this group of diverse kids and diverse learners to the best of their abilities. And so what we saw is this imposition of more social engineering type programming instead of actually looking at the teaching methodology, the pedagogy used, the scholarship introduced, and how it was introduced to see if that's the best way kids learn. And I think one of the outcomes that we've seen, unfortunately, is this decrease in literacy, because instead of assessing phonetic methods versus whole word methods to teach kids how to read, the assumption was made that, oh, this group of kids isn't, able to achieve as high in, English and language arts because the whole education system is racist. When in fact, I think that now more recent data being published and being acknowledged and looked at is demonstrating that the teaching method used, the whole word teaching method used, does not help kids learn to read and can in fact harm their ability to achieve literacy.
Right. What's amazing is how something one would think is straightforward as a literacy teaching methodology could be swallowed up by an ideological framework, right? Like, and we know there's so much data that phonics is a much better methodology than these whole language models that are out there. And I've been looking at some of how that's done, and yet somehow people continue to do this stuff that doesn't work. And I was talking to somebody about this who's a teacher with deep background in literacy and the like, and she says in some ways they don't want it to work. What they want to do is produce results that shows that everybody's sort of failing equally. And what you do is they want the much. They don't want because the more in a way, the way it's been explained to me about this whole sort of new system that's in place that's causing a lot of the problems that we're talking about is they're looking just to bring down bring down the top, right? Like, okay, so let's get rid of the magnet school because the magnet school, or let's make it a lottery because the magnet school is accentuating the disparity. So in closing the disparity, there's really no effort to bring the bottom up. It's an effort just to sort of make everybody equally, equally struggling in some sense, or to just pretend like the disparities don't exist, because then you don't actually have to do anything that really solves them. And I think that's why this is so dangerous. I mean, well, all the ideological reasons and the anti-Semitism for sure, but it also is just really bad for the kids that it's pretending to help.
Yeah, I mean, if the goal of what a K-12 school system is supposed to set out to achieve shifts from academics to politics, that everything is political, education should be political, kind of that wing, that voice of the activist core, then the goal wouldn't be to close the achievement gap or teach kids that are struggling give them the supports they need to actually be able to overcome those obstacles. The goal would be to tear down the structure. And I think that's what we're seeing. This is one of the reasons that this whole activist wing of teachers or community activists that are getting into the school system, I think why they're not only pushing ideas on teaching that don't work, but they're also just outright attacking the things that we know work. We've known for over a century what works to teach kids basic things in K through 12 education. We went from massive, like huge amounts of people that were functionally illiterate in American society from the late 1800s to having majority literacy. And the way that was achieved was through very specific teaching methodologies like phonics, like memorizing the multiplication table. So to pretend that those things didn't work and there was some other form of oppression that existed that needs to be dismantled really, I think, took students off of the trajectory to achieve academic excellence. And now we have major school districts where majority of the population of kids can't read or do math at grade level. So they're doing worse off now than they were during Reconstruction. That's insanity.
That is insanity. And of course, what we're trying to do is also get parents to understand what's happening beneath the surface. Like, a lot of times parents will see something that they'll see two things. One might be explicitly outrageous, like brazenly outrageous from their kids, the Palestine toolkit or something like that. And that they can recognize and they can get all angry about. What they don't recognize are these more subtle ideological markers that basically will tell you that the more extreme stuff is on its way. Last night, for example, there was this WhatsApp group that Brandy and I are both on, and a parent activist asked a question about, do you know what critical literacy is? Critical literacy is this, it really is the same thing as you might also have heard critical consciousness. Now, it might sound fine like critical thinking, right? But what it actually is a pedagogy to teach students how to recognize and resist systems of oppression. So the role of the teacher is to help students be able to sort of look into what they're reading and decide who's in power and what the power dynamic is and all this. Now, what it really does is it politicizes the classroom, of course, right? You're basically setting up a system where the role of the teacher is to look for white supremacy in every nook and cranny of our society and to see how that plays out in what they're reading and seeing. So it's teaching a group of students to look at the world in the way that they've been trained to look at the world, which is inimical to critical thinking. It's the exact opposite of critical thinking. Because critical thinking wants you to look at multiple perspectives, look at multiple lenses through which to see the world, and to figure out what you think is correct through objective analysis. This does the opposite. It gives you one lens and it says, this is how you should look at the world, and we're going to teach you how to do it. Now, for the average parent who sees critical literacy, like they probably don't even see it, but if a teacher catches wind of it and then tells a group of parents, this is coming, they won't even know that it's a problem. They won't even know it's a problem because they don't know what it is. And I think part of a group like our group has to be to start to educate parents and teachers on what some of these crazy ideas are about, so that they know what to look for and they know where they can recognize the smoke, so they can see where the fire is coming from. What do you make of all that? I know that was a big.
I mean, I think that the activist core is kind of banking on the idea that parents aren't going to understand what these things mean, so they can, move forward with what they're attempting to do. But I also want to say that they're also taking advantage of some very well-meaning teachers and administrators who want what's in the best interest of their students, and they're being told or convinced that going along with these things are going to that's in the best interest of students. I think it is a bit of a heavy lift to kind of dissect all of the intricacies of the jargon so that parents become aware. It's still necessary, but it's also, I think that on the flip side of that is, well, what programming is your school district bringing in that deviates from academic excellence? And if there's anything they're bringing that deviates from direct academic excellence, maybe you want to take a closer look at it.
Right. That may be the smoke that we're actually looking for, maybe the best, most powerful talking point. But still, I was talking to a group of people we're working with that are develop a toolkit for parents, right? And what we do is we go through all the jargon, because we want parents to know, if you see critical literacy, if you see critical consciousness, if you see white supremacy culture, we want them to recognize these terms and concepts that are being integrated into the schools that are taking them off of literacy and numeracy and all these other things, and to understand what they're doing. And we were going through it, and one of the people who's sort of new to the process says, this is so abstract and esoteric. How are we ever going to get parents to engage? They're just trying to, deal with their kids. I have to tell you, like, I get that. She's right. Like, critical literacy, what the hell is that? But if we don't start getting more of a critical mass of parents to understand what this stuff is, and or teachers, and to start pushing back, I mean, we're going to have to be more abstract. It's crazy, but what they've been able to do is just build a critical mass of educators and others that buy into this ideology, and then come up with all kinds of words that they use to try to get it into the school system. And if we can't recognize that because it's too abstract or esoteric, then it's going to find its way in, and then your kids are going to get the Palestine toolkit, and they're going to get all kinds of other craziness, settler colonialism, everything else that we've seen in schools, because they're setting up the entire software of the schools system through these types of trainings. And so we have to get parents to be better abstract thinkers and not just activists. What do you think?
I think we do. I think that the question is how. How do we reach? So that's how do we reach that critical mass of parents understanding what's happening in their kids' schools, the educators that actually want to teach kids and not indoctrinate them? Like, how do we get through to them?
Yeah. And it's hard. Like it would be, I wish I could say to them, if just do X, Y, and Z, like really formulaic, really easy, but the people we're dealing with are sophisticated. They're terrible. And they're terrible people. They don't even know that their opinions are are opinions. They think their opinions are facts and that they have a duty to make sure that your kids think that their opinions are facts as well. And they're trying to undermine the very foundations of like sort of um, Western thought and rationality and liberalism and American values and all these things that are the foundations of our society. And if we can't figure out how to, as sophisticated and organized as they are, and start to mobilize moderates and others, we're going to lose. So that's our task, is to become much better at understanding what they're trying to do, so we know how to push back against it, and then to educate school board members. I'm waiting to hear from what the same parent about how her talk at the school board went when she mentioned this critical literacy. I want to know, was she able to get any of them to sort of say, well, wait a second, maybe we should hit the pause button on that?
Yeah, I mean, I have my I have multiple things, but like if there were only one thing that I could do, what I would hope for, and I'm curious to hear what yours is related to K-12 education. Mine is that to either eliminate or do a better job vetting these outside educational consultants that come into districts, bringing all of this stuff into the schools.
Yeah, here's what I worry about. In some cases, that might be it. But if enough of these teachers are now themselves indoctrinated in these pedagogies, they don't necessarily even need the outside consultancy. Like the person who was telling me about what was going on in her school district said that the educators that were leading this were actually not coming through a consultancy. They were coming through, I'm sure they had been through 10 teachers trainings on this stuff and have read every book and know exactly what they want to teach. And so I think what you're saying is one approach. I think, and you've talked a lot about this, is we're going to have to use both existing policies that in schools and pass new legislation that prevents the politicization of the classroom. That doesn't mean that some teachers won't do it anyway, but at least we're going to have the tools in place that say, I'm sorry, but that is not acceptable. You are not allowed to turn your classroom into an indoctrination center for your kids, and to expose it at every opportunity. I think a lot of cases we already have the code, or and you've seen a lot of this, and that's part of what we're going to have to do, is to tell parents that they're in a much stronger position than they may realize in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are two really big questions that I would hope that elected officials and people who make craft ed policy would have to answer. And one is what is the purpose of school? And the second is who's responsible for making sure the school stays on track to that purpose. And I think maybe that those two questions are understood completely differently from the activist core of educators and parents, where
Right.
the radical activist core of people, educators, see school as being a center for activism, and parents are thinking that it's a center for learning. And so I think there needs to be some transparency on that. What does a school district superintendent feel is the purpose of school? And then who's ultimately responsible for making sure that school stays on track with that purpose?
Absolutely. And look, there's a lot of work that needs to be done, and it can be very scary when you think about how much this ideology and these ideologues have sort of penetrated our institutions. Like and it can be depressing, and people can then, what they do is when they see it and they come up against this juggernaut, is they strip down or they try to reconcile themselves to it. You know, you see this among mainstream Jewish organizations. They say, "Oh, this is too much for us. We're never going to be able to defeat this, so we might as well join forces and get our stuff about Jews into the DEI framework and the like." And we think that's the wrong approach. One thought experiment that I often run with people about this is, I say, can you imagine a case, let's say 15 years from now, where a lot of this pedagogy and this radical DEI is gone from the school system? Can you imagine that? And a lot of times I say, yeah, I can imagine that. Okay. Then I say, okay, so let's work backwards. How did we make it happen? Because because the truth is, of course, these things can be overturned. They just seem intractable now, and the dynamics can change, and the politics can change, and the social dynamics can change, and if we allow ourselves to be resigned to the idea that these things are here to stay, we're really going to be in trouble. Our not just as Jewish people who have a special concern here, but as a society, that these things are really bad for our society. And I think we have to get people to start to look in the long term. Like, this is not a quick fix. This is we're in for the next 10 or 15 years to try to reverse these dynamics. And we're going to have to get really good at it. And we're going to have to start embracing sort of more long-term thinking than we have.
No, I agree with that. I also think that it can seem like it's insurmountable, but I know, I think from direct experience, that the other side, for lack of better description, is working just as hard or harder than we are, because I truly think that most people aren't on board with schools being centers of radicalization. Most people in the United States, most people send their kids to school to learn something, like learn something real, to improve their reading, to understand biology better. So I think the other side, knowing that, they're working extremely hard to try to get their goals to replace the goals of scholarship in schools. And that gives that in itself, I think, keeps a lot of us going in really trying to fight back and make sure that our kids have the most healthy learning environments possible.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a wrap. I think we've laid the groundwork for future Jewish Contrarians podcasts, where we're going to go into some of what we're seeing and doing and what some of these trends are. And we're going to argue about them a little bit, but we're also going to hopefully educate you all and help you become better citizen activists, because we're going to really need a large swath of people involved in these issues in the days to come. All right, everybody. Thank you very much. Thank you, Brandy.
Thanks.
And we'll be back with you shortly. Take care.
David.